Welcome back to HRE Insights in 30. This is the podcast where we break down the real world risks, trends, and challenges shaping compliance and, of course, financial crime prevention. And this is especially important for the fintechs, banks, and high risk financial businesses out there. I'm your host, Justin Muscolino, CEO of High Risk Education. HRE is where we train banks, fintechs, and MSB teams on AML, fraud, sanctions, crypto oversight, and emerging technologies. Today, I am very lucky to be joined by someone who brings deep operational, compliance, and fintech expertise, Tracie Kosakowski. Tracie has spent years helping fintechs, payment providers, and financial institutions deal with the regulatory world while building scalable, risk-aware operations. Now, today's conversation is going to focus on a question every fintech leader faces. How can I build operationally resilient programs, strengthen compliance frameworks, and manage financial crime risks while still moving fast and innovating? Tracie, it's fantastic to have you today. Welcome.
Thanks, Justin. I'm so happy to be here.
So we're going to get into it, Tracie. And here is the first question. So, Tracie, you built this really unique career at kind of like the crossroads of fintech operations, payments, and compliance. Now, I'm really curious, what pulled you into the world of building systems that are both, fast, efficient, effective, but still keeping the bad guys out of the equation?
Well, that's a great question, Justin. I really came into kind of the fintech world at the very beginning of even before fintech was a label here. So, early in my career, I kind of really realized one of the biggest failures in financial services rarely came from bad intentions. Everybody working in this sector really wants to do the right thing and really wants to make sure the bad guys don't win. But what was happening is there were process gaps. So well-meaning teams were building fast, had great ideas, but kind of that operational plumbing, if you will, the customer journeys and the risk decisions just weren't keeping up with the builds. So I'm a fixer. I love and naturally gravitate towards fixing gaps. So over time, this really evolved into helping banks and fintechs design systems that are resilient, compliant, and scalable. Because when you have operations and compliance that work together from the start, everything moves faster and there are far fewer fires and issues to deal with.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. And, looking back, there's always big lessons learned we could all achieve by our experiences. And it sounds like you've got a bunch of them. So that's where I want to go next. Your lessons learned across, fintech ops. You've worked across payments, digital banking, what else? Embedded finance, pretty much every corner of the fintech universe. So, what are the repeat offenders? The operational or compliance challenges you see over and over again as companies do try to scale.
Yeah, there definitely are some tried and true uh, tenets here. So, speed for the sake of speed without structure never works and will always break. If you don't build durable operations from the ground up, you're going to have to stop at some point when it starts to crack and when it has failures. You need to embed compliance from the onset. So you need to get past the idea that compliance is a cost center. Compliance is paperwork. It's not. Compliance is one of the key ingredients, I really say to building the concrete of your company. It's about customer protection, but it's also about risk alignment. And when everybody is working towards the same goal and they understand that, it's just a natural evolution. You really also have to think about the controls you put in place, and they have to evolve as fast as your product build. So what worked in the beginning with, your initial maybe 500, 1,000 customers, and you're doing things manually and everybody's kind of working, when you start to pick up, which is everybody's dream, and you start to scale, that will not work. You will have manual process break And what worked with 500 will not work with 5,000 and certainly will not work with 500,000. So your operational design must be iterative as you grow.
One thing that always comes to mind that I always say is that compliance is not a revenue generator, but it's a revenue enabler. I should make t-shirts on that. It's one of my favorite sayings.
Yes.
And, and also what you said, like those patterns that you discuss are exactly why we built, HRE's courses the way we did, because we want them to be real world, operational, and of course, who wants fluff? So this kind of brings me into the next question, risk and compliance in those, high speed environments. Fintechs love speed. Regulators, they love controls. And you've helped teams juggle both. So my question to you is, how do you coach companies to stay compliant without becoming the team that slows everybody down?
Well, you can do both and you can do both successfully, but it has to be a concerted thought process. So you have to take a look at your systems, your technology. Where are you doing things and how are you doing it? The more you can integrate systems and kind of leave the idea of disconnected systems behind, the faster you can work, the more cohesive you can work. The more everyone in your organization has an understanding front to back of the process of what you're doing, why you're doing it, how it benefits the customer, and understands that complete journey, the faster you're going to be able to go because everyone working within the organization understands what they're doing, but also understands how the people to their left and their right, so to speak, work and what they're doing and what the process holistically means. You also have to make people understand. And I say make people, right? Because some people innately get this, but some people you have to teach this. And so that goes back to, some of the educational programs certainly is you have to understand risk. You
Yeah.
have to understand what the ownership of risk means. So if everyone assumes someone else is doing it, really that means no one's doing it at the end of the day. And without risk, there is no reward. So you
Yeah.
you can't ever have no risk. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for controlled, identified risk. You kind of know your left rail, you know your right rail, and you know how you can operate through the middle. I also say a lot of fintechs are dealing with sponsor banks, right? And they need a sponsor bank to help them. That relationship is very dynamic and truly is a relationship, right? So as fintech programs scale, sponsor banks have become more adept at understanding and more sophisticated in the compliance and regulatory and technology environment. The idea of that fintechs are good at tech and banks are good at bank, well, that's kind of bleeding now, right? Because as people have cross-pollinated into these different companies, you have, which is really good for the ecosystem, a mutual understanding of how this works. And always understanding kind of what the bank is beholden to and what makes the bank work. And, at the end of the day, their goal is to preserve their license, and how they do that is very important to a fintech. And
Oh,
then, oh, sorry, Justin, go
no,
ahead.
no, no. You go on. I love it.
I was saying, and the other thing, right? So what do you worry as a fintech? Well, think of fintech more, faster than anything else is fraud, right? So
Mhm.
your fraud can outpace your controls. You have to have people with that mindset of what can the bad guy do? What's the thing that can go wrong here? And constantly be asking those questions. If we do A, what will happen? What could be the possible bad outcome? So constantly having people who can say, and how can this go wrong? How can we prevent it from going wrong? Is super, super important. You don't want a whole group of yes people. That's not going to help anybody get anywhere. You want those people that say yes, but and think about what could go wrong. So the idea here that you come from a place of education and knowledge is so important. And that's why people need to understand things like anti-money laundering, fraud, sanctions, and operational risk.
Hmm.
because you cannot scale and scale responsibly without understanding the fundamental tenets of these disciplines.
Oh, that's well, I like it. And, it reminds me of another quote my mentor said a while back. If you say yes to everything I say, why do I need you? And
Mhm.
that quote actually stuck with me for all these years. But I totally get your point, especially with fraud, because fraud is escalating at, clips now we haven't seen. And it doesn't look like there's any light at the end of the tunnel. But moving on, like I really want to focus a little bit on, the skills that, fintechs and, fintech teams really need right now because fraudsters, yeah, they're getting more educated and they have more tools at their disposal, and payments are getting a little bit more complex. So from your vantage point, what other skills or I would say almost habits do you think fintechs need today if they actually want to keep up?
I think people need to understand data literacy. And I say that, and that's a big, huge umbrella, right? So not everyone is an engineer, has an engineer's mindset, and that's fine. However, you have to understand data movement. So, where does your data begin? And what is that journey of the data throughout the process? I think that is elemental to understanding a process or a product and how that works. And that literally is getting people, whether it's an actual room together with a whiteboard or a virtual whiteboarding session. And literally, I always, kind of say this and being a little old fashioned, guy walks into a bank, right? So let's start from the very onset of the person or the company walks through our front door. What happens? What do they give us? And where does that information go? And that is super important to understand that data journey and the data literacy. The next thing I would say is operational resilience and thinking in that way. So you need to be able to anticipate failure points and design controls that can survive scale in order to be successful. And then I would say this is an old adage. The next one, cross-functional communication.
Mm,
Compliance needs to understand product needs to understand compliance. The engineering folks need to understand what the compliance are doing. Then partner teams, like you all may come from different disciplines, but you need to get together and talk about how this all works together. So when there is misalignment or misunderstanding, that's where risk accelerates. And that's where simple understandings can grow to be problems. I'll also add a few other things in here. So, regulatory curiosity. The landscape is shifting undeniably. And, regulatory landscapes shift because of political ideology, but also shift courts, cases that come up. People have different prerogatives within these agencies. However, you need to understand what's going on in the environment, what the priorities are. You need to stay ahead of what's going on and kind of understand the environment because those that react late are usually reacting late because now they have an issue. I would also say document, document, document. Make good documentation hygiene part of your everyday um, process, really.
mm,
Nowadays, we have so many different amazing pieces of AI software that can do notes for your meetings, help you produce procedures. It's not like the old days where you had to have a scribe do it for you. There are so many good utilities out there that can make this much easier that's in the past. And I guarantee you, the decisions you make today, 3 months later, you're not going to remember that unless you have the documentation to fall back on. And if you don't document it, it literally doesn't exist. So that is definitely another skill that people need to make sure that they're adhering to.
oh yeah, like I could sum that up by saying like the key word, proactive. I love saying that. But it's
Mhm.
proper planning, really solid communication, and the old word of silos just doesn't work. That's some good stuff. But now, Tracy, we get a little more selfish. I want to learn what you're working on. So, what trends, projects are you kind of knee deep in right now? And, what should fintech leaders have on their radar going into next year?
Well, I really say that the things to kind of be on the lookout for are increasing program scrutiny on the sponsor banks and their relationships and their fintechs, right? Because people really have to understand that when a bank takes on a fintech partner, that fintech partner is an extension of the bank, just as if they were sitting in the same row with them inside the company. We can say that. A lot of people pay lip service to that, but it really truly is that expectation. The people at the bank need to understand the fintech program just as well as the people who design the fintech program. And the people in the fintech side need to understand the requirements of the bank. Has to be a symbiotic relationship in order for it to work. I mean, certainly we see faster evolution of fraud that we talked about a little bit here. So always, people will always try to defeat the system. And how can we think like fraudsters? How can we use AI to help us defeat fraud and find it faster and faster? Because it's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen and how quickly you can detect it. Fintechs are also looking certainly into more multi-jurisdictional structures. So, how can you deal with the US regulators and then potentially also expand your product set to other jurisdictions where other regulators have different thoughts? So, that's always very interesting. And then, the good old third-party risk programs here. You need to control your vendors, you need to understand your vendors, you need to understand the risk they present to you and you need to have contingency plans because M&A activity is interesting. We perhaps will see some more pickup next year, but with that means what is going to happen when your vendor and a critical vendor suddenly gets bought out or suddenly disappears because now they've merged with somebody else. How are you going to deal with all of that? And do you understand the risk those vendors present to you, both current and in the future? I kind of always say the idea here about vendor management is the prenup, the marriage, and divorce. You need to plan for all three of those. No
Mm.
one goes into a marriage planning for the divorce, but you need to make sure you have your documentation in order and there's a clear understanding of what's going to happen.
I love it, Tracy. Thank you so much. And listen, thank you for, great discussion. Too often fintechs think, operational speed and, compliance sits at opposite ends of the spectrum. But, with today's conversation, it just really shows like you need strong operations, risk frameworks, because you gotta have that risk controlled, especially when growth is accelerating. So, huge thanks to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And, for our listeners, this is exactly what this show is about, fast, practical insights to help you build stronger, smarter risk and compliance program, inside your fintechs and high risk businesses. So be sure to catch our next episode, which will be airing soon. But Tracy, thank you again for coming aboard. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you, High Risk Education.
Thank you. And thanks for tuning in. To everybody out there, stay curious, keep learning, and take care.